Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author and director of the Centre. And one of the things we really love doing at the Centre is meeting new to us authors who are writing in the area of fantasy. And today I am joined by Lilly Inkwood, who has a novel called The Kingdom is a Golden Cage, which is coming out with HarperCollins in the summer. So good morning to Lilly. Lilly, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are to be found.
Hi, Julia, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I am absolutely thrilled to be here and talk to you about the first book in my upcoming fantasy series. I have been writing for a few years. I've started by writing historical fiction. I've always been fascinated by history. I read a lot of history, even when I was a student. I just loved reading that and politics and myths. And I think I needed quite a few years before realizing that my favorite books, favorite movies, favorite series were fantasy. And before I tried to make a foray into the genre. So this is The Kingdom is a Golden Cage. And as you said, it's coming out this year. And I'm very, very excited for the readers to meet my characters. And this crazy world inspired a bit by medieval Europe, but with very, very bonkers plot twists. I hope you'll agree with me.
Yes. Now, Lilly is also a full-time mum, as many of us are who take to writing. And so if you hear a few happy noises there are a few children in the household. So Lilly, where are you based? Where's your home?
I live in Germany, but I am an immigrant. So actually English is a foreign language to me. I write in English. I started writing English when I took that up a few years ago. But if you think that my accent is a bit funny, well,
no, not at all. I'm just actually reeling with astonishment that actually you're writing in English and there's been no translator in between us and this, because you would not know, everybody. I've read the book and there's actually no feeling of it having been translated. Or you're brilliant. Your English is brilliant. Oh, well, it just puts me to shame. I could not do that. I could not do that. So before we talk about the process of your writing, can we have a little tiny plot summary? You know, what are you putting on the back of your book so people can locate it as a read?
So Celine is a princess who is being pressed by her father to marry, but she didn't want to do that for years and years, since her lover Hugo simply vanished off the face of the earth when he tried to claim his birthright, the Duchy of Langley. The problem is when Hugo comes back 5 years later, he comes back in the shape of a cat. Well, Hugo has always been a shapeshifter. The problem is he cannot switch back to his own shape, the one of a human. But he has a plan how he can enact that, destroy the spells that are binding him, and get a grip on the duchy, which he thinks is his, at least.
So, yeah, within that, we can see there are fairy tale elements. But I first want to talk to you about the use of real history, because what that summary doesn't give a sense of, and it can't because it's a summary, is that this is actually, it feels as though it's part of real politics. And you said it was based on the politics of medieval Europe. How do you go about getting ideas from real history? Are you trained as a historian, or are you just a reader of historical works? How do you go about it?
As a high schooler and as a student, I've read tons of history, from ancient history, Rome, Greece, medieval history, historical books, and I've been very passionate about it. I actually think I should have studied that probably, but it wasn't considered as a career choice by my parents that could earn me money in the long term. Remember, I come from Eastern Europe, and I think it's really difficult there to make a living as a historian, as a writer. So I went on to study something else completely. But the thing is, every time I start writing, everything I've ever read sort of seeps into what I'm writing. So I always have a very loose plan of what I'm about to write. For instance, I had a few plot twists in mind when I started writing The Kingdom is a Golden Cage. And I was at a point last year when I wanted something fun and escapist, and I couldn't find it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write it. I'm going to live in this world. I will live it, what I'm about to write. And as the plot unfolded, as I put that into page, everything I've ever read, I think, stepped into that. And then, of course, I've started doing research when I thought, okay, I could make this a bit more realistic. I've read a lot about town and city in the medieval ages, about the Middle Ages also in Germany, about the Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa. Maybe, okay, this is an old spoiler, I can tell you about this. So you may notice the metaphor of the falcon. Did you know that Barbarossa was a very passionate falconer, and he actually wrote the manual in the Middle Ages about falconing?
So that's exactly a really good example of how something about a real person and a real sort of thread in history can then be wonderfully productive for fantasy. I think is it Margaret Atwood who says she never writes anything that's not happened somewhere. You know, so there is this reliance that we all have as fantasy writers on real things. So moving away from medieval Europe with its multitude of little nations and rivalries and armies and all the rest of it, and moving over, and which of course we're familiar with and used differently in things like Game of Thrones, moving over to your take, which is to meld this with a fairy tale. The first fairy tale I noticed as I was reading it was Puss in Boots, because it starts with one of the ways that Puss in Boots persuades the passing king to take his master with him is to leave him naked by the side of the road, saying his clothes been stolen. And that's more or less a version of that, more or less happens, doesn't it, with Philippe?
Yes, precisely. Puss in Boots was thank you for pointing that out, of course. Puss in Boots was a very important source of inspiration for The Kingdom is a Golden Cage, because I love reading fairy tale retellings. And I always wondered with Puss in Boots, the folk tale, you see this plot develop where the Puss and his master trick the king and the princess into a fief, into a castle, so to say, and into the princess's hands. And I always wondered, how did the princess feel about that? We never hear in the story how the princess felt about being tricked into marriage with a man whom she actually doesn't know. So basically, that's The Kingdom is a Golden Cage. It's Puss in Boots seen from the perspective of the princess. How would she feel about it, about being tricked into it? And how would it be if the princess tried to do some tricking herself?
So in addition to Puss in Boots, were there any other of the sort of great well-known fairy tales that you were using? More like tropes, I suppose, rather than fairy tale whole plots.
I think a big theme in fairy tales and myths is shape-shifting. I think you can find it across all Europe in one shape or the other. Including in the Nordic mythology and Scandinavian mythology. Loki is in the end a shapeshifter, maybe the most famous shapeshifter of them all. Even Freya has a falcon skin, which he uses to shapeshift into a falcon and visit the underworld. So I think people have always been fascinated by shapeshifting, and how would it be to assume the skin of different animals. And I also find it particularly interesting how shapeshifting is used as a trope in fairy tales across all Europe. And I mean also Eastern European fairy tales. I've grown up in Eastern Europe. I've mentioned that. And of course, I've grown up with those fairy tales. So the heroes there often shapeshift to trick the villain into something. And I think that's basically what Loki also does when shape-shifting. He gets into a lot of trouble, and then he has to solve the situation somehow in the advantage of the gods. So I wasn't thinking consciously about that when I wrote The Kingdom is a Golden Cage, but I think that seeped into the structure.
So while you're using the sort of fairy tale structure of, a kingdom with a king, animals like a shape-changing cat and things like that, actually, I really got into the book when I realized that what you were doing underneath all of those other layers is you were writing a spy thriller, because that's the kind of plot it is. It has lots of twists, lots of people there are pairs of people with agendas who are trying to knock each other out and undermine each other. It's like one great big game of that board game Diplomacy, where different people are competing for the kingdom. Were you conscious that you were doing that? Have you got like spy thriller writers that you admire that you were thinking of emulating, or is it something you just came upon almost by exploration and mistake?
I do read thrillers. I think I read about everything from literary to thrillers and fantasy, historical romance, but I wasn't thinking consciously about it. I was just so into the story, and I thought, okay, how can I make this even more surprising to the reader? And what would this character do now? And just by laying out the situation with the different warring parties, you get these situations of conflict that maybe I hadn't consciously planned, but just seeped into the page, just poured out into the page. And I think what I should mention is that I'm a huge fan of Game of Thrones. And I think what I admired most in the Song of Ice and Fire series was exactly the use of history. I mean, you can completely see with George R.R. Martin how he uses the sources of European history and Asian history into creating these different folks and these warring parties. And I didn't set off consciously trying to emulate that, but I think that's what appeals to me as a reader also. So it would make sense that I would try maybe to write something like that.
Yeah. So if you're out there thinking, I don't want to read a fairy tale, actually, you're not really reading a fairy tale. You're reading a spy thriller that has a fairy tale world setting, which I think was a really fun take on the retelling of a fairy tale. Another thing I noticed as I was reading it, that you have a repeated trope, or no, not trope, a repeated structural point where you say, you change point of view and you say, here's my story. This is how it happened. So sometimes they're flashback and sometimes they are descriptions of what's in the mind of I would say the main character was Celine, who's the princess in the story, but there are other main characters, including Magali, who's, I suppose you'd say she's in the wicked stepmother role, if there is such a thing. She's sort of, you're not quite sure if she's good or she's bad or what she is, which and as a shape changer, that stands to reason. But we get quite a few moments where we switch to her point of view. What were you trying to achieve with that? I mean, I know what the effect on the reader is, but what was your aim as you set out with that structural idea?
Thank you so much for this question. I've been raring to answer it because I did have a plan. I think history is awfully subjective, and even the way we remember things that might have happened to us even 10 or 15 years ago, that's always distorted. And if you sometimes ask two different persons about the same event, they might recount different versions of the same event, or from their perspective, the event played out differently. And I think you can see that a lot in the way legends are built around certain personalities, even nowadays through social media. I think that's also an element of gossip, because some events may be changed into something completely different when you try to see the best or the worst in a person. And I think what I've been most consciously doing that was when I told the story of how the Duchy of Langley was created and the people at its heart, who 2 generations before the events in the kingdom is a golden cage, have actually set up the duchy. So you hear different stories about the first duke and the duchess, and you don't know which to believe. But I think that's also very valid for the ways legends were born. I think I've read somewhere quite a while ago that many of the god and goddess figures in ancient mythology were born from real people, real rulers who grew into legends. So I think that's what I'm trying to show in this fantasy world, how real people grew into those legends. And I hope you'll have the opportunity later in the series to go back from the stories that have been woven around these personalities back to the real people and see what happened there, what really happened there, what changed the course of the history in this kingdom.
So, and I think one of the things about doing that is, of course, you end up with split sympathies. So you may think, oh, I'm on, Team Celine or Team Philippe or whatever it is. But then you'll see Magali looking at Celine thinking, oh, that annoying princess, why doesn't she do what I tell her? So you get, you don't settle as firmly as you might otherwise do as a supporter of one particular version of this history. So I want to also, there's 2 big themes in the novel which we haven't touched on, or only briefly touched on. One is shape changing and the other is the issue of freedom. So let's take shape changing first. You mentioned that Loki does this. I mean, it's all over Greek myths, isn't it? With Daphne transforming into a bush and all that stuff. In your magic of shape changing in your world, when somebody changes into a shape like an animal or another person, is it purely a skin that they put on so that when they are being a lion that they are letting out the ferocity that's theirs, or do they actually sort of become that creature? So, I mean, there's a difference there, I think. Yeah. They're always themselves, but with a different skin.
So in order to answer that question, I'd have to tell you a bit about the rules of this world, which is that there are gifts that the mages exhibit in the Red Kingdom, and there are spells, but spells are forbidden. They are arcane knowledge only known to very few people, which is mostly the doyen of the magic school, the Golden Pavilion. So when a shapeshifter uses their gift to change into a creature, then they would still be themselves, thinking and acting as themselves. But when they have changed into a shape and they are bound by spells to keep that shape, unable to change back into their own human form, then do the changes at a mental level come in, and then they began feeling, acting, thinking more like the animal they have changed themselves into before being bound into that shape. So
it's a process of transformation by having the physical experience of being something else. So not mentioning any names, but say a character is transformed into a mouse. They aren't a mouse to start with, but the longer they're a mouse, the more mouse-like they would become. Yeah. Precisely. So there's a danger of trapping somebody in a shape like that.
Definitely.
Yeah. So that goes into the second theme, which is, and I should just say it's very important for anyone who's writing a fantasy to work out the rules of your magic. It's like one of the first things you should think about. Is there magic, and what are the rules? Is it infinite magic, limited magic? Anyway, so going to the theme about caging and uncaging, almost everybody in your book seems to want to cage people, either literally cage them or put them in a position that traps them. So caged by the nature of their role in life. And there's one person who sort of moves against that, who doesn't want to be caged. I don't think it's a plot spoiler to say that, because Philippe is always like this from the beginning. He's more living outside that. But I would say there's evidence that even even he ends up, I mean, there are some things which I think where everybody ends up going along with this idea that everyone has to be trapped and caged. So is this how you see that world based on the sort of medieval kingdom world, that actually nobody can really be free? And who would be free in that world?
Yes, I do think in the medieval times there were a huge amount of rules by which people lived, and very little social mobility from a certain level. So if someone was born a farmer, they would most likely die a farmer. They just didn't have the possibility to move upwards into the world. And I think that was even more caging, as you've said, than nowadays. And I think it was particularly true for women. There were very few that could move outside of the rules that were prescribed to them. And I think, and what I would like the reader to do when reading The Kingdom is a Golden Cage is thinking that Céline and Magali, in their mentality, they are products of that age. I wish they would look at these characters not through the eyes of a woman who lives nowadays, who has access to education, who is allowed to work. I think I would like Céline and Magali to be looked at as products of that society, because society and how we grow up shapes the way we see the world. And I think we can still see that in Céline, because she does not want power for herself. She isn't the realm breaker that would upturn the laws, because it is hard to break out of a certain mindset that we grow up with. Even Magali's mindset, we have to remember, she is in her 40s now. She's much more experienced. She has lived through very difficult times, and that is also a product of her experience. But we are often set up to live by the rules we grow up with. And I really hope that the reader feels that when it comes to Céline and how she sees the world and her own goals.
Yes, and I think that Céline is definitely the one who, for me, goes on the biggest journey up to maturity, about working out, well, if I get this power, what do I do with it? Is really the question that she's grappling all the way along. Okay, so I hope that we've done justice to your book. I noticed that you have mentioned at the end that you're hoping to carry on and expand this world into a trilogy. Will you be staying with the same characters, or have you planned it, or is it just an idea in your head at the moment? Where are you on that particular journey?
I have written 2.5 books already, so The Kingdom is just the first one, and I
think that's very helpful, because I wrote my first quartet, which is for children, the Companions Quartet. I wrote that all before the first one was published, which meant I was able to go back and put in the first one things that I only thought of when I was writing the last one. So it looks as though it ties it all together nicely. So it's no bad thing to have it all in the bottom drawer.
It's the best, because it helped me come to grips with the world building. And isn't it so cool when you have written much of the books that are supposed to come after the first one, and then you can just layer it all in the first one. And I think the reader can really see that and drop some maybe tongue-in-cheek hints to something that would come out later, which maybe don't make much sense now, like the mention of Mermaid's Lake when Céline travels with her father towards Langley. You might want to think about that. Or when Céline is in the library and she comes across a book about her grandparents, practically, and someone has written on the edge of "ha." So you can put these little hints and be a little smug about it and think, you'll see later what I mean.
Yeah.
And I totally love that feeling.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's great fun. It's part of the fun of writing, isn't it? So we always have a section in the podcast where we say, where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something? And because I've been describing your book, Lily, as like a fairy tale spy thriller, I thought it'd be fun to ask where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to set a spy thriller outside, obviously, our own worlds. If you were going to, have another go at this, but in a completely different zone, where would you go?
I think the format works very well with the Game of Thrones. I think that doesn't come as a surprise, a huge surprise.
No, it's Game of Thrones. Yeah, yes.
That's the perfect setting of backstabbing and spies and people minding their own business when claiming to do something else entirely. And I think it's also written as a spy thriller from certain points of view. So I've said I'm a huge fan of George R.R. Martin and what he's created. There, of course, I've been reading much more romantasy lately. Interesting trivia. I did not know that such a thing as romantasy exists before I'd actually written The Kingdom is a Golden Cage. I was always fascinated by fantasy, and I thought, I'd be terrible at writing fantasy because it would be too soft and too inclining towards romance, because that's what I like to read. And it was like the biggest regret of my life. Why can't I write battles better or grittier fantasy? And then I wrote this book because the impulse to do it was just too strong. I sent it to my editor, and while I was waiting for Charlotte to see what she says about it, I came across Sarah J. Maas and Stephanie Garber and Jennifer Armentrout, and it was a huge revelation. It was like, I have found my tribe. These are my people. These people write what I love to read. So it's been a journey for me too, as a reader also.
Yeah, so that gives away. We share the same editor, Charlotte, at HarperCollins, who have potentially the coolest building. Have you visited them ever? Try and go to London, because they're right by the river, right by London Bridge, and from their offices you can see all my favourite parts of London: the Tower of London, the Old City, the Globe. It's just fantastic. They're right by the Shard, the tallest building in London. And I, in answer to my own question, I think I would quite like to have a go at writing a spy thriller in the world of Indiana Jones, because if you remember, Indiana Jones has magic. Some of those, and it sometimes verges in a spy thriller, but I'd just love to write a sort of just before the war, Second World War, somewhere exotic, spy thriller about some key artifact. That'd be great fun. Not something I've ever done, but that's what I would like to do. And you get a bit of fedora wearing and, bullwhip cracking action and chases across deserts. Yeah, no, that would be a good place for a spy thriller. Okay, and what about a fantasy tip? Have you got a tip, either of something you might want to recommend to read, or a place that something you've watched, or a place you go for inspiration to share with people listening?
Well, since we touched upon that a few minutes ago, I think that the best tip would be, even if you don't know what's going to happen to your first fantasy book, even if you're unsure if your if your editor will want to publish that or not, if the impulse is there, keep writing, because the more you write in that world, the more you write yourself into that world, and it would make the first book better. It would make the world building better. And even by going farther along the series with the plot, then you can see where your characters need to be in the first one. Or maybe you have a few secondary characters that are loose ends, and then you definitely see a purpose for them while you have written another book or another two books in that series. I think that helps enormously with world building and everything. So, for instance, when I first wrote The Kingdom is a Golden Cage, I had no idea who Hugo's mother is. She was Hugo's mother. Now I definitely know after the second book who Hugo's mother is, and you are going to love this. She is so wicked. So
you have to write to discover your own plot in that case. I think my tip... my tip would be for people writing their fantasy novel out there is, rather than sitting down and thinking, I am writing a fantasy novel, actually go dig down a bit further and say, am I writing a fantasy detective story, a fantasy war epic, a fantasy love story? Find what other genre you're actually writing in, because you'll probably find a lot of your plot moves, your characters, your twists from understanding what other genre you're working in, rather than, it's some vague fantasy quest type thing. Dig down a bit further and you'll find it a much more enriching experience. So, Lilly, thank you so much for joining us today, and wish you all the best with the publication of your book. I look forward to seeing it on Kindle, presumably first, and then on the shelves, or however it's coming out these days. So the book we've been talking about is by Lilly Inkwood, The Kingdom is a Golden Cage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, for having me. This has been a blast, and thank you for your questions. They were absolutely amazing, and I really feel that you understood my book, and this has been a wonderful experience. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now it's the final days of our Everything's on Sale event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses. Our Memorial Day event ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life sleep.